We have some very young scholars from Jharia University and Delhi University, one visiting scholar from University of USA, and I hope the whole panel discussion will be very vital. The sociology students of our department, some students from JNU, will be benefited from this discussion. Now we have also a very distinguished scholar from JNU here today. And I request Professor Bhatta to come forward and sit along with us in the yes, come. It's okay if you're seeing it. Let's begin with some of my observations, then we'll start the discussions. Today, of course, this is Sociological Center. Then we often come up with some questions of what is sociological. And then we settle down with some basic assumptions about the basic characteristics of the discipline. But then, we do it without necessary self-criticism. And sociological be reduced into a few textbook notions. This panel discussion today seeks to understand the multiple horizons, conventional as well as unconventional. Deeply innovative, I suppose. This panel, some of the young scholars who have taken innovative routes in their pursuit of sociological knowledge would share with us their respective positions and share a debate about the tried and tested ways of doing sociology. They would also share the poetry can be a good resource of doing sociology. They would share that photography can be a valid method of researching and exploring sociological knowledge, and photographs could be a powerful source of it. They will also share that even within conventional sociological framework, some new questions can be asked. One can ask if conventional methods of asking questions in the field is appropriate. We need to be critically innovative in the field. One can ask if the popular methods which you learn in the textbooks or in the lecture or in the research methods could be adequate in generating meanings which is sociology. Then one can ask whether our sense of sociology could be in the harmony with the sense of sociology that emerged in the early space. So I hope that this all panel discussion today will bring a new light in understanding new sociological pathways. I would love to introduce first Ravi Nandan Singh. He has a doctorate in sociology from Jharia University and is assistant professor of Hindu College, University of Delhi. Today he is talking about ways of asking questions when the informants refuse to talk. Methodological questions involved in the study of the morgue. We have Jyoti Sinha as a doctoral in sociology from Jharia University, is a visiting faculty at Brown University, US, doing sociology in which workers, the case of Jharia -4%. Sreedeep has just been awarded a doctorate in sociology from Jharia University and writes photo features in green media. And this sociologist with camera and pen in his hand. Nivedita Ghosh is continuing her doctoral research at the Department of Sociology, University of Delhi, and is an assistant professor at Sriram College, University of Delhi. Today she is talking about camera in the field, exploring the possibilities of a visual research method. Irfanullah Farooqi is a Jharia finishing his doctoral thesis at the Center of Study of Social System at Jharia. He's talking about reading poetry in sociology. And such is yours. And from our department, I think, I believe it's so impossible. If you would like to share something, you can do it later on, after the discussions, okay? This is so, I think we have 25, this is 10 to 3. So the session is supposed to finish by 4:30. So I would request all of you to limit your time within 15 minutes. Then you can have a proper discussions afterwards. So please, my request first. And Ravi, start with this.
In case of request, this is already chapter to start. As I said, I was introduced. I have worked on morgue and previously, so that is what I'm going to speak about. Yeah. So in case you missed, this is the introductory talk on the morgue, and I'll be speaking based on my fieldwork experience in Banaras, India, and also some recent fieldwork that I have been able to do at Denmark in Europe. And I will be talking about the morgue in a comparative sort of perspective, but the kind of comparison that I plan to do is not the same which we have been sort of taught from the kind onwards. So I'll show to you towards the end of my presentation what kind of comparison I seek to do. So I'll start by proposing to sort of visualize the moment in the hospital when death is to be announced, for instance. Now, one of the interesting things about when somebody is seen as to be dying in the hospital appears to be a kind of a medical emergency, which is well known as a medical emergency. That the doctors come by, the patient is put into the ICU, or is, other doctors are sort of called over and so on. But I'm not talking about that kind of emergency. I'm proposing there is another emergency that happens the moment death is declared in the hospital. And why I call this as to be an emergency, because unlike the medical emergency where the doctor and the nurses etc. get on to an alert, in this second kind of emergency that I'm talking about, there is a kind of an institutional emergency, right from the workers to everybody else suddenly become aware, including the other patients who become aware of this emergency. What is then that emergency? Well, I would argue that anthropologically speaking, that emergency is the fact that the just announced dead person has to be separated from the still living people. Right? So that's the emergency that sort of I'm talking about. And as I sort of propose this, I'm arguing that people institutionally, culturally speaking, are at alert at this moment, unlike the medical emergency, right? And remember that when I say this has to be an emergency, this is not announced as to be an emergency, unlike the formal medical emergency, but this is in a way that even though it's unspoken, even though it's informal, even though it's unannounced, everybody is at alert. Immediately that body has to be removed. 5 minutes before, that body was in the hospital, everything was normal. Now that body has to be removed. So you realize that, immediately one of the things that becomes important in medical discourse is the idea of what one is familiar with, that is declaration of death. So before the body is removed, or as I call it, separated from the living to the morgue, let's briefly concentrate on what is involved in declaration of death. So I would sort of try and argue that at least there are 3 important things that are involved in declaration of death. Right? The first, and I think to the most important extent, if one were to look at the declaration of death, not just at the hospital but even before, is the idea that the declaration of death has to be unambiguous. right? You can't, somebody who declares that somebody is dead cannot be ambiguous about it. You can't be sort of saying that I'm not really sure this person is dead or not. We cannot just go bury or cremate him, but I'm still not sure whether that person is really dead. You take your call if you want to cremate and see if he comes back. You can't do that, right? So, culturally speaking, whenever declaration of death is involved, it has to be unambiguous. And I think from the point of view of making knowledge, it is interesting that in post-modernity, that knowledge or that authority is no longer with people. And when we talk about knowledge being ambiguous today, or everything is not clear, everything has to have some kind of sort of middle ground, everything has to have multiplicity and so on and so forth, declaration of death has to be completely unambiguous. So you may notice that the shift that has happened from people having that authority to declare somebody as dead to doctors having that authority now to declare somebody as dead, right? So no longer people themselves can declare somebody as dead, even though somebody has died, you still need the certificate from the hospital to cremate or bury and so on and so forth, right? So the shift in terms of who knows who has died is coming from the doctor. And I think this has important connotations, thinking from sociology or medicine point of view, to which I come. But there is another thing that is quite interesting about declaration of death, which I would propose is declaration of death is a speech act. Now, in other words, I'm saying that when people are declared dead in the hospital, it is an act of language. How? Well, J.L. Austin, for example, let me sort of explain briefly what is a speech act. J.L. Austin, a philosopher of language, argues that many people think that language is just simply about saying and doing is another thing. But it might just could be the case that language also does things. In other words, saying is doing. So, for example, when at Christian weddings, the priest or the person involved in the church wedding says that I declare you as husband and wife, what he is effectively doing is that sort of announcing that you are no longer unmarried, but by mere articulation of this phrase, he has declared these two people to be married. Right? Similarly, I think when we look at the declaration of death, one of the things that becomes interesting is that the doctor has to perform it. He has to say it, in so many words. That here is this person who is no longer living. He may say it in so many words, in various ways, in various metaphoric ways, as we know from Farid also, I'm sorry, live out in hell, so on. But it is communicated to people that the person has died. So it is in fact in the act of saying that you declare that somebody is dead. Why I'm saying this? Because clearly the notion of whether that person is really dead is medically still a contentious question, because as you know in most parts of Europe, etc., when somebody is declared dead, then that person is still living for various other purposes. For example, certain organs could be transplanted, could still be used, certain sort of parts of the body can be harvested medically and so on. So that speech act, which means that person is dead, is meant for the relatives who had that person in the hospital. So if people have questions on the speech act, I'll come back to it. Austin broadly divides it into two forms of the speech acts. One, he calls it as illocutionary speech act, and second, he calls it as perlocutionary speech act. I'm referring to illocutionary speech act, where saying is doing, where there is no gap between saying and doing. Unlike perlocutionary speech, an example could be, for example, hate speech, right? So somebody is saying, inciting you, saying things that may not immediately affect you, but you could go back, reflect on it, and build upon a certain kind of response to that speech. So perlocution works in a latent way, illocutionary works immediately. There is no gap between what is being said and what is being done. So if the doctor is examining a person who is to be announced dead, he examines and announces, and in that announcement, it is known to other people that that person is dead. Right? And clearly there is a difference between other people knowing it through their own knowledge and the doctor saying it. So even if, for example, which often happened in Banaras or hospitals in India, as you sort of know from newspapers, that many people believe as patients or as families of patients that patients are still kept on ventilator even though they are dead, to squeeze more money and so on. So why people have this suspicion? Because, as you can notice, that people themselves don't have the authority anymore to discern whether that person is dead or not. The doctor has to formally announce that that person is dead. So even if somebody is on the ventilator, you as a relative can't pull out your person, your patient, and say simply that I know that this person is dead, you're fooling us. The doctor and the hospital have to announce that that person is formally dead. The third important thing about the declaration of death, which again may be sort of seen in continuity to earlier practices with respect to declaration of death, is that as you know in anthropological context, the dead body is one of the most polluted things that people can think of in almost every culture. I mean, not just so-called non-European, non-American context, but even in the European and the American context, the dead body is seen as a feature which represents greatest degree of threat, right? So in context where, say for example in Banaras, where there is such great ritualistic stigma attached to the dead body, what is interesting again is that when the doctor declares somebody as to be dead, the doctor is in fact the first person to touch the dead body. So in the act of announcing somebody as to be dead, the doctor becomes the first person to touch the dead body. So if you go back to David Parsons' essay, the classic essay on doctor-patient relationship, one of the things that he talks about in that essay is that why the doctor becomes important, unlike other professions in the modern world, because the doctor is not just simply yet another technician. The doctor is important because he has a moral relationship with the patient, right? That he has a contract to alleviate pain and suffering. So the doctor is a different professional as compared to other people because he has that contract. So even though he could be charging money for what he does or she does, the contract is a moral one, where somebody for the first time in human history is completely dependent on that moral relationship in terms of you giving unconditionally, in some senses, your body to a doctor's professional techniques and so on and so forth. But what Parsons doesn't talk about is that what happens in anthropological contexts, the kind that we're talking about, where the doctor also becomes this kind of a figure who is ready to transgress from the regular requirements of ritual and pollution. So he in fact becomes the person. So if you were to think about, there are two people who touch the dead body in the hospital. One are the workers who invariably are of the dome caste, who in fact ritually specialize in being in contact with the dead, and the other person is the doctor, right? And I'm not expanding it here, but if you were to think of it in a broader sense, then the doctor and the dome, in this shared horizontality in the context of Banaras, become two very significant actors in how we start looking at sociology of death. So I'll come back to these questions when they raised your questions. But now come back to the earlier context that I was mentioning. The moment somebody is declared dead, that person has to be separated from the living and is put into the morgue. Right? So at this stage, one may ask this question: then what kind of institution the morgue represents? Does it have any institutional function? What purpose does it serve, and so on? Beyond this idea of separation, right? Now, I would argue, based on my fieldwork, that in fact the morgue doesn't have any institutional function. And why I would say this? Because one of the ways in which institutions can be understood, for those who are familiar with Victor Turner's and Van Gennep's work on criminality and intermediate period from Robert Hughes and so on, you know that institutions, they all specialize in transformation, right? So in other words, that you undergo some kind of change when you become part of an institution. That you come to, say, an educational institution, you come as a novice, you go back trained from here, right? You come to the hospital as an institution, you either get cured or you go to the burial or to the commission ground and so on. So there is a transformation in the state as the institution brings about. I will argue that the morgue is a non-liminal institution, right? That is, there is no transformation that happens in the body. The person comes in dead in the morgue and goes out dead from the morgue. There is no change whatsoever that happens in the ritual state or the state of a body with which the morgue is institutionalized. So, in other words, the morgue becomes a kind of a station, if you like, a non-liminal station of dead bodies. Again, something that is based on observation and could be interesting is that be it Denmark or be it India, be it the ritualistic context of India that we're talking about and the, say, sort of relatively secularized context of ritual and pollution in Denmark, what is again interesting is that all kinds of bodies, men, women, of any religion, of any caste, come to be together in the morgue. Right? So there is suddenly no sort of differentiation, and there is a kind of a horizontality of everybody coming together. So to put all of this together, I borrow from Claude Lévi-Strauss's work in structural anthropology, a concept called zero institution. And I argue that the morgue should be seen as a zero institution. Right? So those who are familiar with Goffman's work of total institutions, so for example, before Foucault, Goffman talks about total institutions, so the prison, the asylum, and so on become total social institutions. I would argue the contra to the total institution to some extent would be the morgue, which would be, according to Lévi-Strauss, a zero institution. Lévi-Strauss, in two dual organizations exist, argues that zero institution is a kind of an institution, which is a very interesting institution according to him, that it is there in all cultures to give meaning to other institutions. Zero institution doesn't have its own function. It is like the empty signifier, that it doesn't have its own immediate function, it doesn't have its own direct function. But why it is important in every culture? Because it gives meaningfulness to other cultures. So if you think of the morgue in between the hospital, the house and the cremation ground, then what the morgue is doing is that it is doing a certain kind of station of the body, which earlier would have been done either at house or at the cremation hut. Right? So the morgue becomes a kind of an institution in between, which is just giving meaning to other structures that be it the hospital or be it the cremation ground. Now, so one of the things that I say, as I said, that the morgue does not bring about any transformation into the body which had been put there, so the body comes in dead and goes out dead. I call that state as to be that of the newly dead, right? And why I call this as to be newly dead, as you know, and as I will show, that there are instances that there have been bodies in the morgue for 2 years, for 10 years, and there have been bodies and nobody comes to claim them. They still would continue, according to my definition, to be newly dead. Even if they decompose in the morgue, they continue to be newly dead, according to me, for the simple reason, because the only way you can have a transformation from the newly dead state is when the body is processed into becoming an ancestor. So if the body is not processed into becoming an ancestor, it remains in the state of what one would call as newly dead. Right? So now to come back to answer the theme on which I'm speaking, that is what do you do as researcher when you informants refuse to speak? So in this case, as you can imagine, it's very hard to speak to your informants because they're dead. So what do you do? So how do you speak with them, right? And so, well, one way, of course, and as most of us would know, is to speak with the living, right? And that's another way to talk about the dead, because the only people who are most affected by the dead are not the dead themselves, but the living, right? And so, as many sociologists have talked about, death is important not for the dead people themselves or those who have died, but death is important in society, in any society, because of the living. So those who survive, for them, the dead is so important that you can go and speak with them, and that's how you can make sense of the dead. That seems to be one way to speak about. The other way, I think, and to me, I think that's more productive at some level, and these two may not be mutually exclusive. I mean, you could have the first option, but the second option that I realized was that, I don't know if some of you would be aware about Pasha's poem, where he talks about what he calls as Murda Shanti, or which could be loosely translated as corpsey peace, right? That in a certain way, most often when peace is spoken about, peace is associated with harmony. But there's another way in which you can think of peace, and that is in terms of deathliness of silence or deathliness of peace. That as if there is no activity, as if there is no movement, as if there is no, joy the beat, there is nothing really that is going, it is hauntingly silent. So that's another way in which peace is, talked about. What I get from that phrase or from that kind of contextualization, interestingly, the morgue in Banaras is called Shanti. So there is a connotation of peace that is associated with the death. So why I was raising Buddha Shanti, because I tend to sort of expand that to argue that the deathly peace is always associated with an equivocation, right? That there is kind of, it is not silent, but it's a kind of sort of speaking noises which go on to be in every direction. So one way in which I could sort of record this equivocation of deathly peace, of deathly noise, if you like, was through Google alerts. So what I did, for 2 years, I had Google alerts of morgue. So that means that every day I get at least 2 or 3 mails from different parts of the world, wherever morgue is mentioned in their news or in any other write-up that they may have. So from all over the world, it is suddenly as if the deathly peace of the morgue is being spoken about in this equivocating noise. So you have Murda Shanti being disrupted from all over the world, and the morgue is spoken about. So that's one way to record, to talk about that which does not have a speech of its own. Right? Now I'll quickly read out some of the examples of Google alerts, and we'll sort of conclude by making a couple of points from there. Yes. Right. Now you can notice from sublime to ridiculous, all kind of associations come to be attached with the morgue. So one is missing Bulgarian found in morgue freezer in Italy after a year. Coimbatore, bodies rot in morgue, no space to bury them. Japan, school gymnasium till Friday, now a morgue. In Yemen, a defined day of mourning, more than 40 bodies of anti-government demonstrators who were shot Friday were taken from the hospital morgue today to Sana University, where tens of thousands of protesters stood waiting to mourn them. Film review. The human resource manager. Suicide bombings are such a routine occurrence in this tragicomedy film that the morgue attendant identifies victims by location. Pizzeria, he asks. No, market, the HR man replies. Zombie threat causes Turkish morgue to get up. Of all things to worry about in a morgue, a zombie is the most frightening for some. one morgue in Turkey is gearing up. TMZ, 22nd October, New York. Lindsay Lohan didn't want to be stiff during her first day at the morgue, so she went in and washed soiled linens, scrubbed toilets, and seemed to enjoy her time with other volunteers. And so the final one. Crime writers vying for honor of having done the mortuary named after them. The project is part of the Million for a Morgue campaign being run by Dundee University to open a new research facility in the city. Organizers have started a voting campaign featuring 10 crime writers who are hoping to win the Morgue Prize. Fans can vote for their favorite author in the online poll, which each costs a minimum of $1. Now, so the final point that one has to make is with respect to, and of course I can't develop it here, but what seems to be interesting is that with at least if you were to think of the crime writers as the final example, that there is a certain kind of fidelity to truth with respect to the dead people that the crime writers are constantly involved with. That in other words, they are exploring what could have been the life of that person who has died. Right? So as most crime novels are involved with, the dead as a central figure of the scene, and then the crime writers go on to explore how the death must have happened, or what led to the death, and so on and so forth. So crime writing, gives us a glimpse of how after death a restorative method could be employed in anthropology or otherwise to seek a certain kind of truth about that person or about that culture in a restorative sort of way, in a restructured way. Right, I'll stop now and you have questions and we will answer some.
Thank you. Ravi Nandan Singh for your interesting presentation on sociology as well as the new understanding of declaration of death, which is I have some very moral stories to share with you about my own emotional feeling about this kind of medical instrumentality of vintage, what happened to my father in the state. And anyway, and also I can recall Professor Peppo from Freedom of Life, what he had been through some of the students in Broadening. Anyway, this is really interesting. Also, your methodologies, informants without informants. This is something very interesting. Anyway, now I request Joyce to take your time.
interaction in sociological perspective, when we come to adopt sociology as a part of one's worldview. And this is something which I'm sure many students would question themselves, like how do we do sociology, what do we do when we go to the field, like how do we collect data. So these were the questions which I had in my mind when I was going to field, study about the Jharia coal mines workers there. So there were a wide array of questions which one addressed when one looks at the workers' problem, like who are these workers? Who are the workers of coal mines? Where have they come from? What is their history? What kind of organizing strategies they had, and how did they shape their strategy, or how were they shaped by them, by the atmosphere of that particular place? What was the men-women workforce ratio? Why the workforce ratio deteriorated, went down at all? And there are many more questions, but today the most important question which I will be addressing is how the social construction of gender shaped the life and work of women wage laborers, and secondly, the workers' health and safety issues. What are the forms of resistance adopted by the workers to oppose the violation of safety rules at the workplace? To talk about the background, Jharia is located in Jharkhand, which is predominantly a tribal state, which came into being as recent as 2000, November, and it's the major coal field in that state. And in that particular mining area, two types of mining takes place. One is open cast and the other is underground mining. This is the location of Jharia coal field in Jharkhand, Zimbabwe. These are the two. I just wanted to bring some of the very important voices from the coal mines while I was doing my field work. Like, what do the people, what do the workers of that particular area have to talk about? How do they associate themselves with the mining area? So these were and that was my basic subjects were the women workers. I wanted to interview these women workers and see how they, what is their attitude towards the people who work in the coal mines? How do they see themselves as a worker of coal mine? So these were the voices that I get from the coal mines. The two important questions which I'm going to address about the social construction of gender which shaped the lives and work of women wage laborers. In that, addressing the first question, I will look at the everyday life of the women workers. I did ethnographic field study and interviewed the women, men, workers, managers, supervisors, trainees and leaders, veteran leaders of the mines to get their attitude towards the workers who work there. The women who work in the government-owned coal mines are very much subdued these days, hanging on to the job in the face of management's attempt to get rid of them. The voice of discontent and protest can be heard loudest from women working in the mines. Whenever I approach these women, like, it was very difficult to approach these women because the management of any particular mines in that area would first ask me, what do you have to talk to these women? Why do you want to meet them? What kind of information they are going to give you which is valuable for your work? So after much struggle dealing with these managers or the supervisor or the coal mines owner, I could get in touch with these women, talking to them, and they had a very sad kind of expression saying that, what do you want to know from us? Do you think you'll be able to help us in any ways by getting to know our lives, by getting to know how we spend our days, how we manage to work in this particular area? They say that they had to fight for every little thing. They had to fight for the job, their honor, the respect, the place in the society. Women had to fight for regulation of their work, to protect the environment from mechanization, the right to live and work in the mines, and to curb excessive corruption. Nationalization of coal mines, which took place in 1971, didn't help them, but created a new threat, that is, the day jobs were being snatched and definitely machine came over and men were the one who took over the job because women were said to be weaker sex or there was no orientation for the women worker in the coal mines whoever were employed there. Another major concern which these women raised which these women workers raised was the question of VRS, voluntary retirement scheme. Some are of the opinion that voluntary retirement scheme, they have been forced to give voluntary retirement because once they retire, they can appoint either their son or the son-in-law or any male member of the family to take up the job, and that is going to be good in a way because this place, they don't belong in this particular place. And when I asked them, what if you don't have any male member in your family? What if it's your daughter or daughter-in-law? They were like, no, we cannot let our daughter or daughter-in-law face the same thing what we have faced. This place actually doesn't belong to women. It's a muscle power zone and it's a male member who would be fit to work in this particular area. So while on one hand the disparity between the sexes means some of the workers support the implementation of female VRS, on the other hand, it views as a means to remove women workers from the coal industry and replace them with male workers. And it thoughts of male dominance pervade the coal field, as many women sacrifice their freedom to provide for husbands or sons. Women in the coalry workforce perform multiple tasks involving simple manual labor such as winding, loading, carrying, splitting coal, wheeling quarters, pushing tar and cleaning boilers, along with other household work. These women are invariably paid less than their male counterparts doing the same job. Gender influences determination of mining job and influence workers' attitude. Women are not given any training and therefore there is no skill upgradation. Men in general occupy the majority of the managerial, top executive and higher level positions, while women are concentrated on the lower level administrative positions or with cleaning and loading job. In office, women end up with the soft jobs such as receptionist, secretary and office clerk. So whenever I went to any of these mines, they all would come up with great expectations or hope that I would listen to the story and help them in any ways to improve the working conditions. So I would ask about the working condition. They would start with there is no toilet facility, there is no restroom for us, there is no place where we can sit and at least eat dinner, lunch. If we take a break in between our managers or supervisors to mark us absent for half day, saying that we are wasting our time. They were not even given time to attend nature's call. So these were the kind of problems that they said. They didn't even have public access to drinking water. When I look at their personal life, like what do they do after work? What kind of settlement colony they live in? So they were the range of problems that they were addressing. And there were few women workers who were very daring and they do masculine kind of work like operating heavy machine job, which appears odd in the coal mines. The workers' ethic often affects the women operators themselves who are conditioned into viewing these workplaces as masculine one and their own role as that of subordinates and on the periphery. Supervisors and trainers do not see women as equal to men, who force women to work much harder than men in order to prove themselves. This implies adopting male working styles and attitude. So I would interview these women and I was like, how do you feel operating this heavy machine? Do you feel you are like different? I mean, does this give you a sense of pride? And they would start with their own story. It's not easy taking up this job. Initially when they start to operate this heavy machine, they were not allowed. Men used to make fun of them, mock at them, call them names. So they were like, this journey is not easy. I mean, there is no orientation for the women workers who work there. There's no training. So if they take up any odd skills job like operating heavy machines or doing any masculine kind of work, they have to face a lot of struggle. Women are secure if they are willing to accept low wages and are at the disposal of the employer. Putul Devi insists that they have to keep on fighting. She has to fight against much bigger adversity than just local Ramdars or the mafia, as that place is dominated by. The struggle is against development, the new economic policy, modernity, and progress, as narrated by another women worker, Asha Henry. Now, so narrative like this question the rigid separation between public and private, marginalization of women from visible forms of work lead to seclusion and domesticity, which tend to close boundaries between spaces between the inner and the outer world. There are a couple of other narratives, but I'll just quickly. Okay. Women have to face this battle, not only working outside, but also at home. Work outside the home is important in shaping the self-perception of women and the relationship with the domestic and the outside. For example, Munna Devi, a woman worker who works in the quarry, she, like many other women in the coal mine, is a widow who has inherited her husband's job. Her knowledge of space in the city extends beyond the bounds of the mohalla. She talks about far-out bazaars and about traveling to distant places in the city with a sense of confidence. The absence of any higher patriarchal authority gives women like Munna a different position. Like she is the main, Munna is the main breadwinner of a family, and there is no other main member in the family who could question about what she earns, where she spends. So she thinks the absence of any higher patriarchal authority gives a sense of freedom. However, stories like her also shows the idea of seclusion did not always exercise a hegemony power over individual life. Restrictions on women's mobility had often more to do with authority structure within the family. Now I would quickly talk about the resistance to work and illegal mining, the safety issues at work. The laboring people in the mining industry do not, however, passively accept the various forms of subjugation, oppression, and exploitation to which they are subjected. They resort to extraordinarily diverse types of collectives as well as small groups or even individual defiances. They range from appropriation of workspace in various ways, such as sleeping at the workplace or gossiping during the working hour or absenteeism, to putting up all kinds of deities in the mines and factories or construction of temple and mini mosque in the mining area. The frequency with which the accidents takes place at the mine reflect the government attitudes towards the mining town. Human life is devalued at mines, and there is a lack of safety implementation at the workplace. The politics of safety emphasize link between safety and necessity for bettering working and living conditions. Most of the labor advocates seem to be believing in labor right politics and stressed on the principle whereby interest of labor is the interest of the industry. In particular, it was emphasized that a short and delayed supply of basic appliances like coal, tar, timber, and safety lights to miners cause long and fatigued work days, and consequently miners are hurried out in the end to finish the day's tasks, which then cause negligence and carelessness, making them prone to accident. There is a serious gap between technology and the knowledge about technology, between problems in handling machines and steps taken to overcome the problems, between miners' awareness and wisdom and capital effort to understand the truth of that wisdom. However, despite the increase in mines accident, coal miners are today economically more secure. The take-home salary of miners is around 8,000 a month for grade D, and it's 10,000 for grade C, 12,000 for grade B, and grade A. It depends on the scale, which is very different for different levels. In case of accident, accidental death, the compensation package is rupees 7 lakhs to 9 lakhs plus a job assured to the family members. Immediately after the accident and death, there are crowd of relatives before the BCCL may shift office seeking compensation and job. However, most of them plead that if a job is given, they should not be deputed inside the mines. There is a safety committee being set up, but most of the meetings that take place in the committees are never taken for the real work situation. They are taken in air-conditioned room, and they refuse to accept the kind of negligence or the kind of lack of safety facilities that should be provided at work. So to conclude, I would say women miners have accompanied the male workforce or replaced them after the death. They were not recruited directly. There is no orientation for them. They are not needed in that gold mines. Women do not enjoy working in the mines as they don't have basic facilities and orientation. When the mines started in 1895, the workforce ratio was 25 to 30%, and in today, in 2010, recent data says the workforce ratio is just 3%. So what happened to these women workers? Where have they gone? The state has no welfare fund for women miners.
Since we are running late and we have remaining 3 discussants, I would request the discussant to limit their time within 15 minutes, and so that we can have more time for the discussions. So now, straight away, I request Sreedeep to speak on the sociology and photography. Sorry to Sreedeep.
So let's stay with this word for the time being. I'm so very glad that some people are taking the initiative to broaden the horizons and push the boundaries. Because I can bet on this that if you go back to the university, it doesn't matter what kind of university it is, whether it's a small town university or the big city university, you'll have ample number of students, scholars, young minds or old minds who complain about a lot of confinements, or a lot of rooftops, a lot of bars, a lot of cages, a lot of confinements which compel a particular person to think, believe, act, read, write, think in a particular manner. And there lies the importance of pushing the boundaries, there lies the importance of trying to do something with the boundaries. So let's give due respect to the act of pushing, pulling, and if required, scratching a bit before we talk about big words like sociology or photography. So, sociology and photography, these are big words with big meanings, big baggages behind them, the words that, meanings that make what they are, and bigger is the question that can there be a platform where they can come together, where they can collaborate, where they can transact, where they can have a relationship, where they can sit, talk, sleep, walk. Do I have an answer? No, they have chosen the wrong person probably. If you look at the trajectory of these two disciplines, photography and sociology are both products of modernity. They are emerging out of this same epoch called the modernity, and they are emerging out in the same century, maybe not in the same decade, but in the same century. And no matter what the differences are, and there's no denial of the differences. On one hand, you have a subject which is primarily textual, full of words and more words, as inherently so, and on the other hand you have a subject, a discipline which is inherently visual. However, they are both aiming at one single thing, which happens to be fact-finding, which has some sort of a sociological or social relevance. So yes, there can be a conversation, however, I still don't have the answer, because once again, if we have to concentrate on these two words and how they have developed or emerged in this country or in this part of the world, it's very, very, very unfortunate that sociology as a discipline has the trajectory, kind of trajectory it has followed. It has blindly followed two things. One, we have borrowed theories from the West and we have done our PhDs with that. And secondly, we have followed the trajectory of the development or the nation building procedure. because of which there are tons and tons of papers, research papers, theses, documents on village, on agrarian relation, on caste, on coal mines, and issues which are directly related to the issues of development. However, and the cost that the poor has to pay because of that development. However, we would choose to invariably ignore some of the things which are very close to us. Maybe the pub, maybe the mall, maybe the coffee table, maybe the restaurant, maybe the college canteen or the university hostel. We would not talk about these things. There is no anthropology or close to none on these matters. And if the trajectory has been so stringent, I doubt that where would be the space to flood the discipline all of a sudden with images. Why? I have no answer. Is it because of a kind of a heritage or a lineage which we inherit, which bars us from doing certain things and only encourages us to do certain other things? Or is it because the two big daddies who fund our research, one the state and another the West, is more interested in knowing more information about casticization of politics and politicization of caste, and less interested in knowing how and why personal meetings have transferred from a parking space to a barista. So, if that is the trajectory, I don't expect that trajectory and that discipline to be accommodative enough to have images all of a sudden. So what is the role of the image as of now, as it stands? Can they have a conversation? Can there be a relation between these two? And don't think I diverted. I needed to say these 2 points to establish the fact that right now there is a lack of conversation. Unless and until you establish that, you cannot possibly draw out a chart. And definitely there is no relation at this particular moment, and that's the reason why we have to address this as a problem in a seminar like this. So, images are fine. Images are fine till the time they are a part of your visual note-taking. Just like we saw now. Instead of writing down your notes while you are talking to a person so that you can prevent selective writing and selective listening, you take a recorder so that you can get as much as you can, and then you can decipher what you want and what you don't. Similarly, you can take a camera, you can shoot as much as you want, as much as you like, and then come back home, put them in your computer screen and see what's needed for a presentation like this. So it's fine. If it's a part of the visual note-taking, there is no problem with that. If it's a part of a greater process of substantiating a textual argument, that's even better. You'll see in those papers which try to establish, our ads are so stereotypical, they in a way reinforce gender stereotypes, so pick up 5 sexist ads and you substantiate your argument with that. Images are fine in these 2 contexts. But the moment you talk about arguing with images, and primarily with images, there lies the trouble. I don't know what others have faced it myself. I was told from various quarters that if you want to argue with images, then these images are frivolous distractions from the text. I don't blame them, I don't blame the system. Maybe I was not convincing enough. Next time I should be. But that is the status of image and the act of trying to argue with images, that they are frivolous distractions from the text. So there is not much of a room. But the question is, that why there is not much of a room is partly something which I have tried to address. But if there is no room, what is it that you can do, and why is there no room? The question is not that can these 2 apparently opposing disciplines, one which is textual, the other which is visual, can have a conversation. The question is, if not now, then when? In the last 20 years, what we have witnessed is explosion of images. What we have witnessed is how image is driving us and driving our quest for identity in various acts of life. Yes, probably I'm speaking like an urban lad, which I am. And so, if not now, then when? It's not merely because of the fact that now cameras are more expensive. Now you don't have to spend 4 crores to buy a camera. You can have an SLR with which you can shoot a video. Hence, the entire thing has become far more interactive. The entire process of generation of knowledge and documentation, visual documentation, being still or video, has become more accessible, less expensive, more interactive. Not because of that. Not because of that we need to incorporate visual. We need to incorporate visual because we are living with these visuals, no matter whether you like it or dislike it. So, following the task of an anthropologist, and following the tradition that we had inherited from Radcliffe, Brown, Malinowski, Rivers, Boas, so on and so forth, if the task is to understand human universals and also to decipher what are the uniqueness, if the task is to understand that complex negotiation between the structure and the agency, yes, we do have an alternative to do that visually. Because it is possible to dissect, it is possible not merely to document, but also to dissect, analyze, describe, understand, and comprehend with images. It is possible to document everyday life, it is possible to document transactions, it is possible to document many other operations which clarify the relation between different social facts and structures. And you'd be amazed to know the amount of similarities which I, as a practitioner of photography, find between the way a sociologist, or for that matter a social scientist, would treat a particular subject, would approach a particular subject, and in a similar manner, a photographer would also do the same thing, would go through the same dilemmas, would ask similar kind of questions. The first and foremost question, for example, that a photographer needs to ask is, if this is my subject, my hand, if this is my subject, then where do I stand with my camera? There are innumerable positions where I can possibly stand. If I'm operating on this floor, which is nothing but a horizontal plane, I can stand here, I can stand there, I can stand in that corner, I can go outside the room and shoot my hand. So, if it's my hand, then of course not. Let's take Dave's hand, for example. So, where do I stand? How far? How close? Should I stand very far? Should I stand very close? Should I negotiate in a distance which is in between? That's the point. And it's not merely the horizontal plane, it's also about the vertical plane. I can go on top and take a top shot, I can keep the eye level, I can bend down and take a low angle. And not to add to the complication, there are innumerable possible angles operating in 360 degrees and to the power infinity where one can locate himself or herself. Now, isn't that the same question a sociologist or a social scientist has, that how to place himself? The objective goal or the subjective notions of empathy would be determined by the placement of the scientist in the field, and that is his relation. That's going to determine his relation with the theme that he's working on. Secondly, once you negotiate with this, you come to the question of what I'm going to include and what I'm going to exclude. At the end of the day, a photograph is nothing but a rectangular piece. Whether you see it on a screen or you see it on a piece of paper, it's a rectangular piece. You cannot include everything. You have to exclude. You have to exclude a lot more than you can include. So you have to go through this tussle of what to include and what to exclude, which is the primary question when you compose a particular frame. A sociologist or any other social scientist will go through the same dilemma while dealing with the subject. How much is required and how much is not. And more importantly, after you have decided what to include and what to exclude, comes the point when you have to decide how to arrange them in a geometrical manner so that there is some coherence, so that these lines which are diverging and converging tell a story or tell a shape which is coherent, which is pleasing to your eyes. That's how a sociologist or a social scientist will deal with the subject while writing or presenting what he has worked on. And most importantly, if, as we have been told since the high schools, that the task of sociology is to flush out common sense, whatever that means, and the task of sociology is to go in the field with an open mind. So similarly, the task of a photographer is also to overcome habitual ways of seeing. If this is Jama, or let's say Taj Mahal, which is the hotshot model for this country. Everyone is shooting Taj Mahal every day. Thousands and thousands and billions of photographs taken every day probably. When you go to Taj, can you give me that perspective with which I haven't seen Taj? If you can, then you have succeeded to overcome that habitual seeing, otherwise keep trying. And that is the same thing which a sociologist or any other social scientist is also trying to do, to overcome biases and prejudices and go with an open mind and find out that perspective which is unique. Okay, I've been told to stay in time and it's my obligation to do that. I'll now show it. Just take 3 more minutes. Give it time? Great. So it's a PowerPoint presentation on a particular theme, a visual theme, on which I have been working on for the last few years. Part of it was exhibited in a solo exhibition, and a very small portion of it recently got published in the Center Spirit of Sandhya. It's a series where I'm trying to argue with images only. Yes, there are 4 distinct arguments which needs to be textually, spelled out. But primarily, I'm trying to argue these 4 points with images. And to elaborate, because I would not be talking when I'm showing the photographs. There are 4 distinct arguments which come across. One is the presence of brands in the city. The larger-than-life presence of it, with which you can't do anything but witness it, be a part of it, whether you like it or dislike it, as I said. The second is the places where it has managed to intrude. In such places, in those places which were earlier not occupied by these images. So it's a case of intrusion. Third is the case of coexistence. Coexistence between bigger brands and smaller brands, coexisting yet competing for more space on a same plane. And third is, of course, the contradictions which are bound to emerge if that kind of a scenario happens in a third world or a developing country. The contradictions that might emerge out of it.
Thank you, Sreedeep, for your very thought-provoking presentation. And I believe it suddenly posed a lot of questions and challenging questions to sociologists, not only sociologists, to other disciplines too. And now I request Nivedita Ghosh to return on camera if you say that.
In the line for us to understand today, and I would, however, like to give, I'm not a photographer, just someone who's interested in images and understanding images, and I would like to give a more of a theoretical view of on camera and how it sort of works down in the field. Now, camera as a tool for research is not specific to the social sciences. Biologists use cameras to study light forms, physicists use camera to study motion, and in that way, social scientists are to use camera to study social behavior. However, social phenomena cannot be studied using the camera in the same way. For example, one can study motion in physics. That is, the camera cannot be treated as a mere recording instrument. And one of the prime reasons for this is that the subject matter of the discipline of sociology interacts right back with the camera. And therefore, in spite of being a non-human material object, the camera is capable of influencing action. And it is with this premise that any understanding of the use of camera in sociology has to be understood. That the camera records not just action, but perhaps what Max Weber had called social action, or what Herbert Mead called interaction, or what Deleuze referred to as a rhizome, or as I will be using in my essay, what Bruno Latour understood as a network. In this paper, therefore, I look at not so much of what data does the camera look at, the camera record, but I'm looking at more of the process of the use of camera in the field. So I'll begin with understanding, or basically trying to explain what has been the literature on the use of camera been like primarily. So the study of visual data within the discipline of social anthropology can be broken down into two kinds of literature. One that focuses on the meanings and representations, and two is that which brings attention to the process or technique. The first one I call representative studies, and the second I call processual studies. Now, within representative studies, authors attempt to explain the possible meanings that images possess. They connect these meanings historically, culturally, through the lens of gender, class, economy, and so on. And I would, and Sreedeep's presentation did a bit of that. The second kind of literature is that which focuses on the process, which also Sreedeep touched upon, or the techniques that enable the generation of these images. Now, processual studies have been scant, but definitely not missing from academics. The processual literature is on the everyday life of the image. What made it possible, the limitations imposed by the camera, the weather, the light, the people. How did the researcher hold the camera? Did she hold it at all? Was it mounted on a tripod? What lenses were used, and so on. Now, processual literature therefore contextualizes the image not through interpretation, but through the very act of its generation. And it is within this kind of image that I situate my own work, this kind of literature. Now, one has to therefore understand the major debates within processual literature just to make a sense of what has happened historically in the world of images and how sociology has studied images. Now, I believe that in the trajectory covered by visual research, one problematic view was historically replaced by another problematic view, and that has been one of the most, that in a way reflects the condition of visual sociology today.
The initial entry of images in social anthropology was based on a conception of the world that sat out there. And all one had to do was objectively view and capture this reality. And this is evident in the work of Haddon, Malinowski, Franz Boas, and even Evans Pritchard. Now, the observer was safely separated from the field through the lens of the camera. However, with the emergence of critical debates around objectivity, it was now argued that through the visual exercise one could only acquire a partial version of the world. And this version of the world that the researcher acquired was acutely affected by her intentionality. An image thus was a result of a subjective vision that may render a sociological analysis incomplete and skewed. A field worker was thus allowed to take photographs and videos, but only as an aid to memory or an illustration, rather than regarding them as suitable research data. So what I see historically there has been a pendulum-like swing from celebrating complete objectivity of the camera on one hand to suddenly recognizing that it's actually a very subjective instrument. Further, to overcome this objectivity-subjectivity divide, different writers have suggested different ways of conducting visual research. For example, Sarah Pink talks about images as a sensory medium, and she says that sensations should be included within social analysis. Similarly, authors have asserted that because visual media is so subjective, the least one could do was to develop certain objective ethics that would regulate the actions of researchers on the field, so that neither the respondent and especially not the viewer of these images feels deceived by the tricks of the camera. The most disturbing proposition, however, to my mind, has been that of devising strategies to access visual data. In their book, Photography as a Research Method, the colleagues talk about how, in order to establish friendship bonds with the locals, the field worker must first photograph people and sites that are held in pride by the community, such as local heroes and monuments. Seeing this, the locals are going to be happy with the researcher and would be very welcoming of this outsider. Apart from this kind of searching for a middle ground, there have been other people, for example, David McDougall, talking about the filmmaker's experiences, the spectator's presence in the vision of the filmmaker, the voice of the respondent, and so on. And recently now, if you look at the context of Indian context, filmmakers themselves have started talking about the very presence of the other when an image is created on the field. So, for example, Saba Diwan says that a camera can be usurped by the respondents themselves to serve their own purposes. So what you notice here is that the film process is not just about the researcher. It is very much an act of negotiation between different players. And therefore, given this background, is it then possible to look at visual research outside of the realm of ethics? We must also ask ourselves, is ethical visual research not required? Is it not important? But for example, Professor Benway, in his article on the nature of sociological discipline, had pointed out that common sense is nothing but a local or a contextual understanding of the social world. And I believe that so are ethics and strategies. What is ethical and what is strategical in one context may not be very useful, may not generate desirable results in another context. Therefore, visual research is not about developing visual ethics. And therefore, it is required that one also moves away from the objectivity-subjectivity debate for a while. Because when we see an image as either an objective or a subjective creation of the researcher, we suggest that only the researcher and nothing else has created that image. And at that point, we fail to see the image as a result of certain negotiations made possible in the field. I argue that in the creation of an image, the researcher is only one of the actors and not the only actor. Accordingly, I attempt to present the understanding of visual research in the broader framework of a methodology. From the outset, something has to be said about what we mean by a sociological method. The definition that I have used has been put forward by Ausweit and Turner, who argue that social science in social sciences, a methodology indicates two different areas of work. First, a method comprises of methodological issues raised by various sociological perspectives, for example, functionalism, Marxism, and so on. Second, the method is also about specific research techniques and concepts that are employed during the very research process. These specific techniques may themselves be varied by a lot of perspectives. A sociological method is thus a collaboration between theory and on one hand and technique on the other. And a visual method is also very similar. That is, it could reflect issues pertaining to certain sociological theories, for example, gender, race, class, caste, and at the same time, it is also about a certain technique of collecting visual data. Therefore, an understanding of the technique of the process is very much a part of the relevant definition of a visual methodology. To understand the technique or the process of the visual, one starts off by understanding what are the kinds of data that researchers visually record on the field. And I argue that the field worker gathers two kinds of data, visual data from the field. First is a social setting, and the other is social interaction. These are the two kinds of data that a visual researcher and anthropologist primarily picks up from the field. The social setting comprises not only of inanimate objects, buildings, rooms, and sounds, for example, but also people who may not necessarily be a part of your research, but they very much influence the research and they render a certain meaning to your research and also the image. Now, I'll basically hurry up, but just to say something about the social setting, that in anthropology the social setting has a very important concept because it is the social setting which has a tendency to freeze people in time. And therefore, one of the important reasons why visual data is not taken or understood as relevant data because it has conventionally frozen people in time. Eric Hirsch, however, suggests that the reason why social setting one could overcome this is by allowing the background of the social setting to speak or interact with the foreground of the people. The social setting is not just a background where interaction takes place. Social setting in a photograph, if you see, is also about very much of the interaction between the people and the setting itself. So it's a continuous process, and this is something that has to be remembered while understanding visual research. The other part that the field worker picks up is social interaction. Now, social interaction takes place between what I borrowed the term from Latour, between certain actants. For Latour, actants are both human and non-human agents that are capable of guiding or influencing an interaction. To Latour's actant network theory, we can decentralize the research process since it does away with all interpretation that places the researcher as the center and as the only creator of an image. An image therefore becomes a result of interaction by various actants, and I identify 5 primary actants responsible for the birth of an image. That is the camera, the settings, the respondents and the non-respondents, the researcher, and what I mean as cumulative knowledge. Now, I will not go into the intricacies of all these actants, but I would like to talk briefly about the final actant, which is cumulative knowledge, just to explain what exactly it means. Now, Latour's network model, network theory, has often been critiqued for not taking account of the a priori, or what exists before this network emerges on the field. Now, I attempt to address this through the concept of the cumulative knowledge. Now, the presence of the first 4 actors on the field does not necessarily lead to the creation of a research-based image. What is required is an understanding about the field and about the social phenomena under investigation. But just like visual research is not possible based only on the understanding of the researcher, it is similarly not possible based purely on the understanding of the respondent. Therefore, visual research is never just about showing what your respondents have to say, or it is also never just about showing what you have to say. Thus, there is the birth of the final act, which is cumulative knowledge, which is really the coming together of the perspective of the researcher and the respondent. And thus cumulative knowledge therefore addresses the issue around. It is a kind of knowledge which basically allows visual research to grow with negotiations rather than it being a one-sided interpretation. Finally, I would like to say that all these 5 actors do not necessarily act in harmony. They do not necessarily act in collaboration, which means that I must say I was given 20 minutes, and that is how I prepare my presentation. And I have to. So the collaboration that I'm talking about is not always harmonious. That is, for example, one of the first questions researchers have in their minds before they go to the field with the camera is, will I be allowed to click a picture, or will I be allowed to go into the field with the camera? And this is because all the actants do not act in harmony. The camera may be restricted, the setting may be restricted, the respondent may be restricted, such that in a certain setting may allow visual research, but the respondent may not allow it. A certain respondent may allow visual research, but the setting may not allow it. Therefore, visual research, I will just briefly sum up, is in visual research, all these 5 actants have an influence on the final image. I'm not saying that all these 5 actants have an equal influence, but I'm also saying that the camera and the researcher are not the only actants that have the most power or that have the maximum power in visual research. And this comes across, especially when you're researching up. For example, in my case, I'm looking at filmmakers, and they are the last persons to come before a camera. Because in this case, my actants are never, my respondents are never really harmoniously contributing to my research. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nivedita, for finishing up your presentation. Now I would request Farid to summarize this presentation in 12 minutes. Sorry for that. 15 minutes. Because we are running half an hour late. So our audience can have more time for discussions.
Thank you. Well, in the beginning I thought being the last speaker I'd have perhaps more time, but now I think it's quite the same. Well, the theme says reading poetry in sociology. Researchers rejoice. I'll come to the theme in a while. I actually have a while. I really don't have much time. But let me very briefly share with you what is it that occupies me as a PhD student. My work, I come from the Sociology department. My work deals with the life of a poet, especially with reference to his poetry and letters. And in fact, I wanted to pay attention to letters, but given that he's a young poet, I'm talking about Ahmad, who's a contemporary of the world, late 19th, early 20th century, and played a remarkable role vis-a-vis the entire generation of Muslim identity in Vietnam and India. So I'm looking at that, and primarily with reference to his poetry, his letters, trying to track the evolution of his thought. Now, I think when we talk about PhDs, when we talk about research in general, what is really important with reference to the context in which we study, we research, we engage, is that, see, ours is a society that is sort of determined by certain larger political, economic objectives. Ours is a society that is driven by market. Unfortunately, ours is a society, and now I'm referring to academia in particular, that is driven by transnational publications, that is driven by peer-reviewed journals, and we unfortunately do not have much scope when it comes to our association with these bodies. Therefore, in such a context, when you work on poetry, when you work on the life of a poet, you really don't know where exactly you're heading. Because, frankly speaking, in sociology, poetry is not as excuse my usage, as hot as things like caste, identity, ethnicity, class, and so on. Poetry is still not there. Poetry is still a foreign thing to many of us. I find this unfortunate because this is not something that should have happened, given that during the late 1950s, 60s, and pretty much in the 70s, people like C. Wright Mills, people like Robert Nisbet, Goldner, were repeatedly emphasizing the importance of interdisciplinarity, the importance of imagination with reference to the promise of the discipline. But we are in 2012, and unfortunately, as far as the institutional setup is concerned, there's not as much appreciation of poetry within sociology. Moving further, if one decides to not go by what market determines,
then one also decides to confront not really a crisis, but something that unsettles him. Because one is engaged in something which has a very different language. That's point one. One is engaged in something which does not really have that widespread an audience. And one is engaged in something which, well, as far as the short-term side is concerned, that many takers. So not many are interested in that kind of analysis. In that context, I would say that it is, for me, what is more important in this particular context and how I have overcome this is that for me it has been a very personal kind of a journey. I have somehow tried to distance my professional self, the sociologist in me, from the one which is into poetry. I don't write that much, but I do read. And at one point of time, after a series of all kinds of courses I wasn't really interested in, and I was given an opportunity, I ended up doing sociology of literature. Having said that, now once you start the journey, what happens is that given the kind of status poetry and literature have in sociology, the overall methodology that we stick to, we adhere to, can also lead to a lot of questions. Whatsoever time I have, I won't really talk about my research as much as the kind of questions that such a research generates, the kind of problems that such an endeavor has for us. So when you do sociology of literature, I mean, some of us might be aware of the overall premise of the discipline, that how literature has a social basis, literature is rooted within the society, there is a link between social reality and literary imagination and so on. You realize that the writings, for the most part, are essentially hijacked by the Marxist school. I mean, for the most part, it's the Marxists who've written and written brilliantly. There's no denying there's something quite promising about the kind of literature we have from Marxists, starting from Marx and Engels to Lukács to Gramsci and so on. And it is in this context that I, as someone who's always had a certain kind of reverence to poetry, and at the same time being institutionally affiliated to sociology as a discipline, had to confront a kind of a crisis in the sense that how do you see the sociological while you're reading poetry? I'm still not into reading poetry in sociology. I'm still dealing with the preface as it were. So how do you come to terms with the sociological? First of all, how do you realize what is sociological in poetry? And I think it is here that perhaps the whole idea of broadening intellectual horizons, the whole idea of new quests, that becomes very important, because whether we agree with this or not, no matter how progressive we become, there's still something very conventional about the way in which sociological gets defined in the mainstream academic discourse. There's still something very, very usual, very old-fashioned, as far as my own engagement is concerned, about the word sociological. There's still some scope for imagination. There's still something missing as far as sociological is concerned. More importantly, what happens with such a restricted take on sociological is that poetry also gets defined through the parameters of sociology. See, when we talk about multidisciplinarity, when we talk about interdisciplinary approach, and when we say that sociology is in need of borrowing from fiction, from poetry, from folklore, from history, then we are also indirectly trying to point out that sociology is in need of a language that it does not have on its own. That sociology is in need of concepts that do not belong to the lifehold of society. So we need a historical imagination. We need literary imagination. We need constructs from poems. We need metaphors. But what happens as far as the practicality of it is concerned, that eventually it is sociology that sort of ends up determining the overall engagement. So whenever we are dealing with poetry, if you look at the kind of works that have been done in sociology of literature, I mean, first of all, there are not many, but if you look at what interests us as sociologists, essentially poets who have belonged to a certain ideology. So it is not primarily about poetry as much as about the poet's allegiance to a certain canon. And I think this is where it is not just problematic vis-a-vis academic inquiry, but also sociologically speaking in particular. I think this has severe consequences. To speak poetry in a certain fashion, because if I were to define, first of all, I don't think I can define poetry, critics have. For me, poetry is more about an orientation. It's just about an outlook towards life. It is not something that is restricted to a department, to a poem, to a poet, to a line, to a paragraph, whatever. Poetry is more about it's a life world. It's a different it's a different facet of imagination. And when something as diverse and something as rich as poetry is defined through terms that are sociological and through terms that are seldom revisited, I think that's where there is a problem. And more importantly, this is not something that I'm saying, I'm of course not that innovative. This is something that even the Marxists have pointed out. So for instance, people like Leo Lowenthal, people like Terry Eagleton, Raymond Williams have repeatedly emphasized the fact that the Marxists are losing out as on the essence of literature, because they're constantly looking at literature as something that is related to the superstructure. They are looking at poetry and literature as something that is rooted in the superstructure, whereas these people would insist that one should not look for the roots but the reasons. And the moment you see at the reasons, there is a scope for some kind of a dynamic engagement. Now moving further, in the course of such a pursuit, how does one do it? How does one come to terms with, on the one hand, the personal within oneself? There's this tremendous passion, there's this tremendous appeal that you have for poetry. And on the other hand, there is this institutional demand that is there from the center, that is there from the market in general. How do you sort of look at it? So first of all, I would say that perhaps we need to get our definitions in place. To what extent are we defining poetry the way we should? And to what extent are we defining sociology the way we should? For me, as I've already said, it is a different orientation, poetry. And sociology for me is not just about a study of society or a study of the social, but it is once again about a very different kind of imagination, an imagination that looks at the relationship between individual, and again I'm quoting C.Red Mills here, the individual, the society and history. And believe me, once that imagination comes into being, I don't think there is anything that is outside the purview of sociology, because it's too overarching. I'll just give you an example, and as to how this kind of a crisis comes into being. I'm working on Iqbal, as I've already shared, and Iqbal was in Germany during 1907. He was in Heidelberg. He was doing his PhD from Munich, and he stayed in Heidelberg to learn German and get acquainted with German philosophy. And in Germany, he used to take a walk right next to a river, which is Neckar. And he used to take a walk there. And every day he would walk there, and he walked there for about 3 months. He was there for 3 months. When I was in Heidelberg, of course I did visit the South Asia Library and the Iqbal section where I did interact with the scholars, the students and so on. But I made it a point to walk on that same stretch for as many as 3 weeks. And I would walk. Now, when I walked there, I really don't know what kind of an imagination did it lead to. It was a remarkable blend of sociology and poetry. I really can't put it into words, but the very fact that the poet you're working on walked on this road for as many as 3 months, and there is a slight possibility of your footsteps coinciding. Now that in itself is very, very self-assuring. This is the idea of personal limit of research is concerned. But interestingly, when I shared this with some of the professors, and these are professors of history, in particular South Asian history and sociology, South Asian studies, they just did not find anything meaningful about it. Now, and I can't really blame them, because perhaps there isn't, apparently, there isn't anything meaningful about it. But I think as someone who has decided to go for a very unusual kind of blend between the personal and professional in the course of research, I think such activities do lead to insights that are perhaps not possible in the Murthy or JNE library for that matter. So I can of course never defend what I did for 3 weeks, but all I'm trying to say is that the institutionalization of the discipline, the institutionalization of academic inquiry, the specialization that we inhabit in our day-to-day life is such that unfortunately reading poetry in sociology is not as attainable as perhaps it is in reference to film studies and photography. And to end, I don't have much time, but I think while we say that through sub-disciplines or through these offshoots such as sociology of knowledge and sociology of literature, we manage to bridge something, we manage to bridge two different worlds like sociology and poetry. But I think what we also need to remind ourselves is that a bridge also tells us about the distance that is there between the two. And by saying this, it is not to sort of disenchant the audience or to sort of create a spirit of hopelessness, but I think such questions in themselves are incredibly poetic in the course of one's research. When we realize that there is the bridge invariably communicates the distance, there's something quite meaningful about questions. Perhaps these questions will take us forward. Perhaps these questions will at some point broaden the intellectual horizons of our community as budding sociologists, students, and so on.
Thank you for your presentation. We really love to listen to you more about your sense of art, because that's where you are in research on. Today, this is all that I don't know what to say. Let's 15 minutes. We can take some serious questions. That's serious. And first, you are discussing, so you have to ask one question.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Okay, thank you. I really appreciate the presenters. So, especially photography and poetry. To tell you the truth, so since high school, I have rarely read poetry, and so only today did I realize how much I must have missed all these past few years. So it was incredible, and also this basically methodological because. So I have a few questions. Mostly. So first of all, this dead voice, talking with dead people. So how this Google Alert is related to this Banaras research site? I couldn't get that straight. And then second, I have Jyoti. So how do you manage your access to that site? You say like managers problems. And what about this workers' expectation? So how do you manage these things? How do you respond? And then I have a question to Sreedeep. Right? So basically, both of you, right? So this Bruno Lagos, acronym for theory. So basically, is there a contradiction? Like Sreedeep wants to talk to photographs as it between two human beings, and there are this host of actors. So I could not quite get that. So again, for poetry, I have interest in social. So human life is class, it is sex, it is gender. So how does that feature in poetry? Is that worth doing? So I remember reading a few people like Howard Becker, Pierre Bourdieu, and I don't know, John Berger or the ways of seeing or maybe John Berger, right? So I see a lot of social going on in poetry, photography. So how to, still I couldn't get it, so how to tackle these things called social in poetry, even if I agree that poetry and photography should be viewed as system or maybe cultural system. They have their own life. The signs or symbols talk to each other. That's fine. But still, what role the social should play in our research? So, thank you.
Okay.
my question is to Sreedeep. I just like to know, sociology is more about capturing what is already happening. And when you do it from a sense of photography, is it like, you are waiting for things to happen? You are trying to create something that is not existing and you are merely trying to give that a picture and present it socially. Whereas when you study sociology, you are actually looking at things that are actually happening out there. Photography is fine with the view of social change. Like I've seen a picture recently that's called Beginners. It shows how America was before and how it's now and how it's like there is they show social change with photographs, and they show how things were changing, how it looked then, how it looks now. Everything is changing. But with photography, the kind of study that you're doing, is it like you're mainly trying to create things? You're trying to collaborate things that actually don't meet.
So when you have body as that, and I'm very interested in what you say, the more humans the body's not transformed. But in any case, I think this one was in there. Is there a point where we could also start with the body as kind of object once it does have life? The question of life, the dead body and the life form, if you work with the dead body, the fact of the matter does not it's also does life sometimes. We then start looking at it as kind of object. So that's one thing I was being curious about. That secondly, if I could ask you a little more about this question. So I'm trying to think about the work of death, and obviously we got to marriage, death, and bananas and all of that. And then we start seeing the idea of the dead body as a muting object by itself. So it's muting and leaves everybody around connecting to it, which is why funerary rituals are actually quite long around specific. And then you're bringing the question of death. And I think the closest comparison between religion itself and where you say it's kind of secular sort of approach to the dead body. So you said there are some similarities to what you asked, similarity and difference about this question about the other things, questions, I'll ask you both of you, that you're available, so you can I'm very supportive of what you are actually doing. I don't have a crappy handle on and I don't really use it as long. The problem with images, I'll speak from my experience first, when I was doing fieldwork. There was a point where if you were using a camera, and I was just using it as sort of like an aid to document and aid to chronicle. The problem was a lot of people, it's with any kind of research, any kind of journalism. You have situations where communities have also become very shrewd, and I mean shrewd in the sense that they're very much aware of the power they're very much aware of the power of representation. So there's one problem is they have a preset, so there's an idea that you're here to document us and perhaps represent us. What do we get out of it? Is it a kind of representation we'll be happy about? So then came a lot of questions about what is your politics, where do you come from? And secondly, the thing about the visual medium is, and anything that uses a recording instrument, I mean, for me, fine. When you're in the field, the basic instrument for, say, an anthropologist is your notepad and a pencil. And then you bring in the dictaphone, which I use quite a bit. You bring in a camera. And the problem was, anytime you brought in something that was technological, something that was an object external to you, they would be interested. So I have to say, if I'm interviewing someone picks up the recorder and starts talking into it and playing around with it. The other thing is, it was seen as a kind of intrusion into their private space, first of all, because it's like a third eye coming in. And number two, it is also the fear of being recorded for posterity as well. Someone can tell you something. It could just be a verbal thing, and they can deny we said anything, but talking about a photograph, or let's not say photograph, let's say an audiovisual medium like film, is that it is seen as record. That will serve more as evidence than hearsay in court. If you these kind of forms of these things will emerge as we develop a kind of method in using visuals as opposed to just text, or in place of text.
My question to Sreedeep, as you have mentioned that we are from starting we study our big daddy, so West and the States. So I have no issue with the study of the big daddy. But my question is that why we can't accommodate our Uncle Premchand, as our Premchand as our heiress, and Godam is one of our meta narrative, and to study to understand our village, all the social structure which is available, such as the Godam and the Sharachand, we have our own, I call them kids, because they have really understood and they have really cooperated. Why can't we accommodate them as our new kind of, as the name of this discussion is that pushing boundaries. So can we do that?
I have a question for Sreedeep. For the photo essays which you showed us, I just wanted to know why you chose to do the photos captions. I just wanted to know why you chose to do your photos captions.
Very brief. The first question about Google Alerts, you clearly write that it does not have to do with bananas per se. The whole idea of using Google Alerts, in fact, is to move away from any one particular field side. The point is, as I said in the presentation, that when you start thinking about more, two things seem to happen. One is the setting involved, where the relatives are, the handlers of the dead body are. That's where you have one kind of ethnographic site. The other side is that precisely of morgue, where the dead people don't speak, but another deadly noise becomes available through Google Alerts. So kind of a voice